Tom Corbett is with us now. How are you today?
I'm just fine. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm excited to talk to you about your new book, which is called It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time. What is that book about? Because it sounds quite interesting.
It is a memoir of sorts, a group memoir of a group of young college graduates in the 1960s who traipsed off to India in the American Peace Corps. And this was in the called the Wild West of Peace Corps days, when it was pretty primitive and we didn't have a clue about what we were doing. So this is a hilarious and very funny rendition of our trials and tribulations and triumphs on occasion, told from the perspective of a whole number of us. But I gather the stories and I tell it in a single, thematic approach. It's sort of a reminiscence of a group of people, 40, 45 years after the event. So, but it's funny. It's sad sometimes.
Yeah.
It's insightful, and it really captures the 60s and the kind of the Kennedy era, when we were going to save the world, which is a lot different than a Trump era, where the world almost went into the toilet bowl.
Yeah.
But yes, go ahead.
What made you want to write this book originally then? Because do you have experience of writing, or is it just this story that captured
No,
you?
I was an academic for my professional career. I was at the University of Wisconsin. When I retired, I realized I had a lot of writing left to do. Not so much academic writing, although I've just finished another co-authored academic book, but personal writing.
Yeah.
So I've actually written a slew of books in the last 5 years. Slew is like 6 or 7. And this one really came about because my group from the 1960s, called India 44, we got together about a decade ago for a reunion. And it turned out to be a very emotional experience.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the genesis or the source of the inspiration to write the book.
Yeah. And how come it's taken you so long after all this happened to get down and write it?
Well, the reunion probably took about 40 years because people are off doing their lives, right? So probably about a decade ago, people started to retire or think about retiring. And I think they also realized a better appreciation of their own mortality.
Yeah.
We weren't going to be around forever. So we were going to either meet or never meet. And so we met about 2 or 3 times over a period of about 5 or 6 years. So that was, so that's probably represents a delay. And I think when you're still a young man, but when you get as old as I am, you'll find that you start thinking about your own life. And so I've actually written about 3 memoirs. I wrote one called Confessions of a Clueless Rebel, which got fantastic reviews on Amazon. And that's like the post-World War II period. And then I wrote a book called Confessions of a Wayward Academic, which is the story of my policy career. I was involved in welfare reform and poverty policy. And I was very contentious in the States in the 80s and 90s and so forth. I wrote about that. And this was a book about my Peace Corps experiences. I've also written a series of fictional works as well. So I've been very busy on the writing.
So that's very diverse, isn't it?
Yeah, sort of kind of 3 different kinds of books. Well, 4 real. Well, I've got the memoirs, I've got the fiction, and I've got what I consider semi or real academic books. There is a real academic book will be out next April. And it's called Evidence-Based Policymaking, the 2nd edition. It's co-authored, but that was a real academic book. It's not light reading, but the rest can be read by anybody.
Yeah, and the title of this book, then, It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time, suggests that in hindsight, maybe it wasn't. Is that right?
Well, I think that the title was meant to suggest that we all signed up. We were all recent college graduates, and we were just collected off of mostly liberal arts colleges full of ideals, and still enamored with John Kennedy. And but basically, we were made into public health people or kind of agricultural experts with a little bit now we had quite a bit of training, but you don't become a good public health person. Most of the women went into that field, or an agricultural expert, in a few weeks or months. You know, and then we were dropped into very remote parts of India and said, okay, work your magic, without much support. So in many ways, it was set up to be a disaster. And the fact that it wasn't a disaster, I think, probably is a testament to how good these young volunteers were. And, you know, and in fact, if you look at their subsequent life trajectories, this was a really talented group of young people. But the situation was not the best situation. You know, you're dropped in the middle of nowhere. You really don't know. You don't really have the expertise in what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
People don't know really why you're there. It wasn't, you know, there were a lot of problems. Yeah. But it was a period of time when they were just recruiting lots of people. They wanted Peace Corps to be big, and they didn't give. And it was, like I said, the early days of the program, and so there were a lot of issues with it. But it's still around, and it still does good work around the world.
How long did you spend doing this in India then?
2 years. It was a 2-year hitch, and I think a couple of people extended for a third year, but I was not one of those.
Do you consider it an important part of your life, even though it was only for a couple of years?
I think absolutely. I mean, you know, if you talk to, when we got together, it was clear just how meaningful that experience was. Yeah. It was, I suppose, like being in a war or something like that. It was a very emotional experience. You know, we started off with like 100 people in the first day of training.
Wow.
And it was a long training period. And I think there were probably about 25 or 26 at the end of 2 years. I mean, it was about right. Yeah. And it was illness. There was a lot of other things that went on. So it was a kind of a trial, a very testing experience. But I know personally that I picked up lessons about what it means to live in a foreign culture, cultural awareness, a lot of stuff about myself and what I could do that was invaluable. I never would have picked it up in any other way.
Yeah. Except through that. It's an amazing thing to experience, isn't it? A lot of people want to have the experience to go and travel for years, and you were given that, and to do a lot more than just see the world, to also help out as well.
Exactly. I mean, it's you know, it's. I think it's a far different. Not far. Well, it's a different experience today.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, because they do a much better job of sort of selecting people for specific jobs that they can actually do.
Yeah.
But also, you're not as isolated today. You have, you know, cell phones and cyberspace. I mean, you can connect. When we were there in the late 60s, I mean, we were up in rural areas, far from the maddening crowd, and you were very alone, and you get to know yourself and quite well when you're faced with that kind of isolation and primitive living conditions, and you're questioning what you're doing there because you don't really have a really good skill set to bring to the situation.
Yeah.
So it was very difficult. It was challenging. But I think most of us, or all of us, thought at the end it was worthwhile.
Yeah. If the joy of missing out of technology existed in the 60s, that would probably be the closest thing.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll tell you, you know, I struggle with technology all the time because it's age related, and you know, you young people get it, and I'm always screwing up. But I would have given a lot I'll just, one example. I left a girl behind that I had dated in college, and actually, once I get over there, I realized how much I really did love her. But she didn't. But she went off and married. She met a guy while she was working at Harvard, and went off and married him. And I thought, well, and we then reconnected many years later, several decades later. We said if we had been able to stay in touch,
Yeah.
if we could have contacted one another and talked, it might have been a very different experience. We might have hung in there.
Yeah,
But
if it happened 40 years later.
well, 40 years later, I just ran across her on Facebook. I hadn't been in any touch whatsoever. I sent a message, and I thought, no, she'll probably take out a restraining order on me.
Yeah.
But no, she was just thrilled to hear from me, and we just through cyberspace, because we were both married, but we reconnected with the same level of warmth and affection we had 40 years ago. It was good. I mean, she subsequently passed away from cancer, but it was it was bittersweet, because in some ways I thought life could have been different in many ways, but it was nice to connect with her before she passed, so that we could sort of finish up old business.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a nice way to reconcile. And I suppose if you had found out she'd passed and you hadn't done that, you'd probably regret it.
Absolutely. It would have been a big empty spot in my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, where are we able to find this book everywhere and have a read of it?
Well, the best way to find it is on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, and I think it's in all versions, Kindle and soft and hard copy. You can find my other books at www.booksbytomcorbett. That's TOMCORBETT.com. And I've got a new one that'll be a new fictional book that's the third of a series coming out probably right after the new year, called Felicitous Fates, and it follows up two other earlier volumes, Palpable Passions and Ordinary Obsessions. That's a kind of a saga over 3 volumes.
Oh.
I thought that the third volume was going to be the end of it, but I'm getting pressure from readers to do a fourth one now. We'll see.
Well, that is very exciting. Thank you very much for coming on the show today, then.
My pleasure.